Thanks, and good morning, everyone. I love coming to Canada, and so when they invited me to return to this Dig and Delve, she said I was at the first, so when they invited me to return back, I was just thrilled. It's great to be here, and I like seeing my friends. I like seeing Daniel again. He's doing great work over here, and then especially I like to see my very good friend, George Sinclair. So it's always great to be here in Ottawa. I've got some other Canucks, you're called, right? So I've got some other friends who are Canucks, but they're in different provinces. So, hey, wonderful to be here. And so we're going to have fun as we talk about, are there, did the earliest Christians borrow from pagans, pagan myths in order to form the foundation of Christianity? And this kind of works in with the question that's being asked here several times this weekend. In a world of 10,000 religions, is it credible to believe the Christian religion is true? So in this lecture, I'm going to be talking about one of the objections against the Christian view, and that is held by a lot of people on the internet that says that the Christians borrowed from pagan myths. Now, this was popular about 100 years ago, but for a very long time, scholars have not held that Christians have borrowed from pagan myths. It started with Roland de Vaux around the year 1933. He wrote a critique against such a view to say that the Christians borrowed against pagan myths. And then you had Gunther Wagner in 1967, Jonathan Smith, 1987, Mark Smith, 1998, and then as far as I know, the most recent monograph on it is by T.N.D. Medinger, a senior Swedish scholar. It's called The Riddle of Resurrection, and he wrote in 2001. Now, in that monograph, Medinger says that the consensus of scholars today is that the Christians did not borrow the myths of dying and rising gods from pagan myths. But he says he takes issue with the consensus of scholars. And he says he believes that there are at least 3 and as many as 5 dying and rising gods in ancient Near Eastern religions that predate Christianity. So he's a very careful scholar, and he says he might be wrong on these things, but he does acknowledge that the consensus of scholars today say, nope, Christians did not borrow. And in the end, even though he thinks that there are 3, maybe as many as 5, he says, but did the Christians borrow from these? And he says no, and he gives a number of reasons why. So the majority of scholars do not think that the Christians borrowed from pagan myths. In fact, almost all of them would say they did not, even though it's very popular on the internet. But just because you publish on the World Wide Web does not make you a world-class scholar. I mean, your only qualification for publishing on the web is you have to breathe, right? So, let me talk about 6 reasons to think that the Christians did not borrow from pagan myths. And we're going to focus, a lot of these are going to be focused on resurrection because that's what I'm speaking on later today. What's the historical evidence? Can we present a historical case that Jesus actually rose from the dead? So a lot of these are going to pertain specifically to the resurrection, but not all of them. So let's look at this. Reason number 1 why scholars today reject the view that the Christians borrowed from pagan myths is that dying and rising gods in the ancient Near Eastern religions were almost always tied to agricultural cycles. Now, what do we mean by that? When I was a kid, when it was thunderstorming, I'd say to my mom, what's lightning, or what's that thunder? And she said, well, that's the angels bowling in heaven. How many of you had something like that happen? Okay, most of us. All right, so you make up these myths in order to explain natural phenomena. Well, in antiquity, every year, even today, but over there you'd have, your droughts, and then the rain would come. And this would happen every year. So you say, well, how do you explain this? Well, one of the things was they'd say, well, you've heard of the god Baal, right? Okay, well, Baal was the storm god. He was in charge of the rain, the wind, tornadoes, lightning, hurricanes, all that kind of stuff. And he had a brother named Mot. And Mot was the god of the underworld, the netherworld, where people go when they die, okay, in this gray, shadowy existence in the underworld. And Mot and Baal did not get along well. So one day, Mot is taunting Baal, and he says, you think you're so powerful with all your storms and stuff. Why don't you just leave all that behind and come on down here to the netherworld, and we'll see who's the better man, better god. Okay? And so Baal says, all right, let's do that. And he leaves his heaven up there, and he comes down, and he goes to the underworld, and Mot swallows him. Well, how do they know this? The parents are talking a little bit later, and he said, well, Mot's done something to our son Baal. Well, how'd they know? Because it wasn't raining anymore. It was drought season. So the mother says, all right, I'll take care of this. And she goes down to the underworld and the netherworld, and she says, Mot, what have you done to your brother? And he said, I swallowed him. All right, vomit him. I won't do it. Vomit him, I'm telling you, I'm ordering you to vomit him. I won't do it. And so she beats him up. And finally, Mot says, all right, I'll do it. Just leave me alone. I'll do it in my time. I promise I'll do it. Just go back to the earth, upstairs. And so she does. And a little while later, the dad turns to the mom and says, Baal is alive again, our son as well. And what do you think was the clue that led him to that? It's raining. So it's these agricultural cycles, and it was the same thing, the same story every year. Would happen like that, all right? And it's like Baal and Mot, it's just these gods. They don't exist really within space-time and all of this. And sometimes they talked about figures in the gray, distant past. But it usually was made to talk about the different agricultural cycles. Well, as Medinger points out in his book, The Riddle of Resurrection, the story of Jesus' resurrection had nothing to do with the agricultural cycles. And it wasn't something that happened in the gray, distant, unnamed past. It was something that had happened within their lifetime. So it doesn't fit up. It doesn't really fit with what the ancient Near Eastern religions were doing. All right, number two, it's highly unlikely that pious Jews would embrace pagan influence. Think of who the earliest Christians were. They were pious Jews who were involved in heated discussions over matters within Judaism, such as whether Jewish Christians needed to maintain temple purification rites, whether Gentile male Christians should be required to be circumcised, whether Christians could eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols, and even whether Jewish Christians were allowed to eat in the same room as Gentile Christians. Now, when you're going to debate over the minutiae of the Jewish law to this extent, is it really plausible to imagine that these same Christians are going to engage in wholesale borrowing from pagan religions to form the foundation of their own? Let me just give you a little idea of what the Judaism and the law would look like and how zealous they were, many of the Jews were, for their law. Very similar to how Muslims are and have been in the past, and many continue to this day. You see things like if you show depict Muhammad in a drawing or something like that, in a cartoon, in a newspaper, it can be riots and violence and death. Muslims get highly offended at these things. Well, Josephus tells the story back how in the early part of the first century about Pontius Pilate and how he did something to really infuriate the Jews. Romans had these things called standards that the military would take with them. And what a Roman standard was a wooden pole, and at the top of the pole was a Roman eagle made in metal or something, okay? Yeah, a Roman eagle at the top. Well, on this one particular occasion, see, Pilate didn't like the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem. So on one particular occasion, he took these Roman standards, and the Jews didn't have any problem with the Roman standards, but he took these Roman standards and he attached to them an image of Tiberius Caesar. And he brought these standards into Jerusalem. Now, Pilate, he came to Jerusalem during things like Passover, but usually he was stationed in Caesarea. And so he was there at the time in Caesarea, and when these Roman standards came in with the image of Tiberius, the Jews were infuriated with this, and many of them went to Caesarea to complain to Pilate. And they went before him and they complained, and they just complained and they complained. And finally, Pilate just got fed up with it, and he said, now, you guys need to disperse and go home now. The Roman standards stay. Disperse and go home, or I will execute you immediately on the spot. And these Jews who were complaining laid down on the ground, extended their necks, and said, we would rather die right now than be witnesses of our holy city being defiled. This gives you a little picture of the zealousness of the Jews to maintain purity for the Jewish law. Are we really to imagine these same kinds of Jews who were now Christians engaged in wholesale borrowing from paganism, incorporate that into their own religion? It's really just implausible. Number 3, many alleged parallels are known to have been true of Jesus. So things like when you talk about historians of Jesus, they're almost in unanimous agreement that, and I'm talking about not only Christians, scholars, but also agnostics and atheists and Jews who are historians of Jesus, and the thing they're trying to do is to prove, what is it we can prove about Jesus? What is it we can know from him apart from faith, if we just look at facts? What is it we can know about him? Well, virtually all of them agree that he was a traveling itinerant teacher in Palestine in the first century, the early first half of the first century, first third of the first century, and that he attracted many Jews and some Gentiles as followers, that he taught in parables, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds and that both he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. Notice how I worded that? I didn't say that these scholars, like the skeptical ones, acknowledged that he performed miracles, but that he performed deeds that he and his followers regarded as miracles and exorcisms, and that it certainly astonished crowds. They agree that Jesus was crucified on the orders of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, died as a result, and that shortly after his followers had experiences they were persuaded were appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, what's really interesting, just take for example that he was crucified, that he performed deeds that he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms. Well, these are the things that many critics, skeptics will say, well, the Christians borrowed these from pagan religions. But wait a minute, we have enough historical evidence to establish that Jesus actually did these things. So how is it that they borrowed from pagan religions if this actually occurred? That's problematic for the view. All right, let's go to number 4. Parallels are inevitable given the immense number of historical events. Parallels are inevitable given the immense number of historical events. Now, in the United States, many of us are aware of a plane that took off from Massachusetts early one morning, and just after 10 o'clock in the morning, it flew into one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world in New York City between the 78th and 80th floors, killing everyone on board. Now, maybe many of you know what I'm talking about because it's when the B-25 flew into the Empire State Building on July 28th, 1945. Huh? You thought I was talking about 9/11, right? Actually, I wasn't. I'm talking about the story about the B-25 flying into the Empire State Building on July 28, 1945 actually happened. You can look it up. There's photographs of the aftermath. It really happened. The same floors that the 767 flew into the South Tower on 9/11. Isn't that interesting? But you wouldn't say that 9/11 was a myth or copied off of that previous one that had happened like 55 years earlier, right? It's just a striking coincidence. When you are talking about the immense number, the enormous number, the mammoth number of events that have occurred in human history, you're going to find parallels. It's going to happen. You just can't help for it not happening. Likewise, many of you are probably familiar with a large ocean liner, a ship that a little over 100 years ago, it was considered unsinkable, and it starts sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. On a clear April evening, it was going a little too fast, and it hit an iceberg, and the unthinkable happened. It sank, and more than half of its passengers died due to a lack of lifeboats. Now, the name of that ship, it started with a T, the Titan. The Titan, in a novel titled Futility, The Wreck of the Titan, written and published in 1898, 14 years prior to the sinking of the Titanic. Now, isn't that amazing? Everything, including the name, is so similar. But you wouldn't say the sinking of the Titanic, it's the next slide. You wouldn't say that the sinking of the Titanic didn't occur, right? It did occur. But because events, and there's so many events in human history, you're going to find these kinds of parallels, and you're going to find a lot of them. Here's something that I just played with this one day. John F. Kennedy, he was a president in the United States back in the early 1960s, and compared him with Jesus, you know. Both of their names begin with a J. They had a father named Joseph. Both of them were leaders. Both made wine, right? This is the next slide. Both were killed in the presence of a woman who loved him. Both experienced a head wound. Both had a brother who was expected to take his brother's place, and that brother was killed. Isn't that interesting? Here's another fun one. Oh, I really like this one. You got to pull this one up. It's just a bad connection over there or something. Poor guy, he probably feels bad too. All right, so how many of you seen the Clint Eastwood movie, Gran Torino? Isn't that a great movie? If you haven't seen it, go home tonight and watch it. It's a great movie. It's vintage Clint Eastwood. All right, Eastwood is this nasty, racist, I'm truly a racist. I mean, I don't know how it is here, but in the U.S., everybody's a racist now. If you disagree with someone, you're a racist, all right? But I mean, this guy, the character of Clint Eastwood, a guy named Walt Kowalski, is this really nasty racist. He hates everybody who's not white. And he's this crusty old Korean War veteran who has no friends. All right, so I decided, well, let's see if we can draw parallels between him and Jesus. So we can. Jesus had disciples, and if you remember the movie, so did Walt. He mentored a little boy. Well, not a little boy. He was a teenage boy, probably 16, 17 years old at the time. Okay, so there's a little similarity there. In the Gospels, they report about a boy who provided a fish that fed 5,000. Does anybody remember what Walt Kowalski called this boy, this teenage boy that whom he was discipling? Fish head. See, it's all part of, very similar to feed the boy providing the fish that fed the 5,000. Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan," whereas Walt Kowalski said, "Get off my lawn." Jesus said, "I'm the light of the world." Walt Kowalski, toward the end of the movie, said, "I've got a light." Jesus was killed. Walt Kowalski was killed. Oh, sorry about that. Hey man, the movie's old. You should have watched it by now. It's not my fault. Jesus leaves the Holy Spirit to his disciples. Walt Kowalski leaves the Gran Torino to Tal, the boy he was mentoring. And then with Jesus, there's the Shroud of Turin about his resurrection. Well, Gran Torino, the word Torino is Italian, meaning Turin. It really is. So you got the resurrection in the movie Gran Torino. See all the kind of parallels you can draw? You can find parallels in anything if you look hard enough. So you see some that are really impressive, like the World Trade Center building, things like the Titanic. But if you just play around with it, you can have a little fun with this yourself. All right, so these generally aren't too impressive to scholars, though. All right, number 5, you have to form a composite figure of these parallel figures in antiquity to get one to make it even sound impressive. So, for example, the closest figure to Jesus that looks like Jesus, who predates Jesus, is a guy named Asclepius. Now, Asclepius was a mythical figure that goes back hundreds and hundreds, perhaps even 1,000 years before Jesus. He probably never existed. He was known as a healer, and on one occasion it said that he raised a dead person. All right, but that's it. Those are the only parallels to Jesus. So that wouldn't be too impressive. The closest parallel figure who comes after Jesus is a guy named Apollonius of Tyana. Now, Apollonius of Tyana actually existed. He died at the end of the 1st century, and the first real report we have of any substance. And you've got these allusions to him and things about him elsewhere, but the first biography that we have that's been preserved today is one by a guy named Philostratus, and he wrote that around the year 225, or about 125, 130 some years after Apollonius had died. Now, Apollonius of Tyana was a traveling philosopher, and he had several teachings different than the Christian teachings. But what was his fate? Well, some said he never died. Some said he died. Philostratus reports that when the Romans came to get him, that the windows of the upstairs room where he was staying flung open by themselves, and he ran and leaped out the window and disappeared. Well, Philostratus then reports that someone reported that they saw him alive again, and he proceeds to tell the story how it was some followers of Philostratus. Now, we don't know if these were the original followers and this happened a week later or a couple days later or a few months later or a few years later, or that these were followers of the teachings of Apollonius who lived a century later. We don't know. He doesn't say. But these followers of Apollonius were gathered in a room, and one of them was asleep, fell asleep, and he said that Apollonius appeared to him in a dream, and he woke up and he says, I saw him. Did any of you see him? Nobody else saw him. And that's to be the equivalent of a resurrection appearance. Not too similar, okay? That's the closest we have afterward. So, because these parallels aren't too similar, you've got to make a composite figure. You take a bunch of them and you combine them. So you start off with the Dionysus. And Dionysus had a divine paternity and made wine. And then you combine that with a Thor who had his life threatened at birth. And then you combine that with the Asclepius, the healer. And then you combine that with Apollonius of Tyana, who rose from the dead, you could say. Forget the differences. They're not important. What's important are only the similarities. And then you combine that finally with a Hercules who is said to ascend to heaven. Never mind the fact that ascending to heaven, it's because he threw himself on a fire committing suicide, and then he ascended on the horse Pegasus. But we won't bother with those differences right there. You just take the similarities of all these figures and you combine them together into a composite figure to get something that looks similar to Jesus. Now, you can understand why historians aren't impressed by that. It'd be similar to maybe 500 years from now, a historian saying, hey, just realize something. Abraham Lincoln, American presidents, Abraham Lincoln was this tall, lanky Illinois senator who was elected, became U.S. president for 2 terms. was elected to 2 terms. And John F. Kennedy was a U.S. president who got a degree from Harvard. And then they had a popular television series called 24 with Jack Bauer. And you had a character named David Palmer who played the first black U.S. president. And you combine these 2 figures who existed over less than 200 period of time. Palmer never really existed. You combine these 3 figures and what do you get? Barack Obama. First black U.S. president who got a degree from Harvard, was a tall, lanky Illinois senator who was elected to 2 terms as U.S. president. Barack Obama never existed. They borrowed all these things to form this mythical figure named Barack Obama. And of course you'd say, that's insane. What a stupid way to do history. Well, that's exactly what these skeptics do. And they've got to grab more figures over a 1,000-year period and put them all together into one to make it look like Jesus. So you can see again why this is not impressive to historians. You might fool some people on the internet, but it's not fooling historians. And then finally, number 6. Stories of others returning from the dead reveal a deep longing for immortality. Romance novels, movies involving romances are very popular, right? Does that mean that romance is unattainable? Well, of course not. Most people can experience romance, okay? So why do we have so many romance novels? Why do you have these kind of movies, 50 Shades of Grey, and all this that attracts so many people? Fictitious stuff. Because romance is a deep longing of the human heart. We can't seem to get enough of it, right? But that doesn't mean the true stories of romance can't exist, that all of it must be fictitious. Well, in a similar way, not all people, but most people don't want to think that death is the end of things. We want to think that there is a God who is going to make things right. There's going to be a reckoning. That there's going to be a God who sets the record straight, who rewards the righteous, and who punishes the wicked. You don't want to think if you've got, let's say you live in ancient Rome, and you're living under their iron fist, and 1/3 of everybody who is living in Rome is a slave, and more than 90% are living below the poverty level, and you have all these kinds of injustices done to you. You don't want to be thinking that this is just it, and I wish I was rich so that I could live this life, that kind of life, but boy, they've enslaved me, and now I'm living this miserable life, and there's nothing I can do about it, and nobody cares about me, no God, this is just the way it is, and they're going to get away with that. You know, it's really wonderful when Jesus comes along with the Sermon on the Mount and he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." That's good news. So when you're living a miserable life like that, and that's the way it is in many places in the world today as well. When you're living a life like that, you have a deep longing for that immortality. Listen, my parents have both died within the last 4 years. One thing that has been a great comfort to me is knowing that I'm going to see them again. If I didn't have that comfort, that'd be pretty rough when your parents or someone you love, maybe a spouse whom you've been married to for 60 years and they die. And just life is terrible at that point. You're just grief-stricken. To have that hope of immortality makes a huge difference. Well, think about it. If you have that hope for immortality, should it surprise us to find stories, even fictitious stories, of people returning from the dead peppered throughout all of human history? We would expect these kinds of things to give hope to others, that this life is not all there is. But fictitious stories that would be expected of people returning from the dead does nothing to tell us whether a particular story like Jesus' resurrection is false, any more than a plethora of fictitious romantic stories tell us that genuine romance is unattainable. You follow me on that? So we can see there are plenty of reasons. I've just given you 6, there are others, but there are plenty of reasons to think that the Christians did not borrow from pagan myths to form the foundation of their own. But the question that remains is, do we really have any good evidence to believe that Jesus actually rose from the dead? We can see there aren't any really good reasons to think that the Christians borrowed the resurrection story from pagan myths. But is there good reason to believe that Jesus rose from the dead? That's something I'll be discussing this afternoon.